Welcome back, everyone, from what was a beautiful lunch. I love a working lunch. You know, we're working, but we're networking, we're having fun, we're laughing. Over lunch, I find it really nice to network at events like this because you learn so much about what other services are doing, what's working in Victoria that could be working better in the ACT where I hail from. But I also learnt that having a husband, which is something I aspire to, is not all it's cracked up to be. I thought, you know, I got some valuable advice over a cucumber sandwich, if you don't mind. But as we come back from lunch, the important conversations continue. But as I just thought I'd share with you, recently I was in Canada on a speaking tour for a month working with the Canadian Public Service Commission. And I just wanted to reflect that the conversation around diversity and inclusion is not one that's just limited to us here in Australia and in Victoria and in Melbourne, but certainly in Canada, they have just introduced for the first time federal accessibility legislation. And as part of that, there are a number of different elements to that legislation, but a key part of that and a key interest of mine as a leader in the disability employment services sector was federal legislation to create 5,000 new jobs over 5 years, specifically identified for people with disability. And I think that there is this great cultural shift that we are all an important and integral part of. And I could not be more proud to share the room with such strong and fierce advocates as yourselves, and indeed share the room with other people with disability who are every day advocating for themselves for a bigger and better deal in many areas of their life. Now, over lunch, you would have seen some great music clips playing. I certainly had a sing-along. I danced. I sung quietly to myself because at karaoke I never win because I sing terribly. It's not where my talents lie. However, welcome back, everybody. And this afternoon promises to be exciting, engaging, and that's just my outfit. But also the content of your fellow colleagues in the sector that have generously given their time to be here today. I just want to draw your attention to Daru have placed postcards on your tables to collect your thoughts and ideas of the kind of resources, training and that the network can do and that you would like Daru to provide to assist you in your work. Now, you can write anything and everything on that postcard. You can also write messages to me. You can draw pictures. You can give me, you know, any tips on how to find a husband, what to do, what to wear, whether I have the skin tone and eyes for the flamingo, I'm not sure. Any feedback is positive feedback, and I think that opportunities like this to engage in that feedback real time is really important. So please feel free to share your thoughts and ideas because it makes our sector stronger and more resilient moving forward. We'll now move to a really important session that I'll introduce titled, It's a Royal Two. What can we expect? Joining me on the panel for this important discussion is Leah Van Poppel, CEO of Women with Disabilities Victoria, Kristy McKellar, Family Violence Advocate, Dr. Meg Clement-Couzner, Senior Policy Officer, People with Disability Australia, and Gerard Brody, CEO of the Consumer Action Law Centre. Please welcome our panel.
Thank you for that great introduction, Wayne. We're here this afternoon to talk about a very serious topic with a not so serious guide dog in the front. Lisa, sit down. Go on, down you go. Good girl. We know that the issue of the abuse, neglect and violence against people with disability has been long-standing and well understood, frankly, within our community for a long period of time. Advocates, like many of you in the room, have fought for this issue to receive a higher profile over a long period of time. In Victoria, in 2015, we had an inquiry into disability abuse in disability services. And in the same year, we also had a Senate inquiry at the national level into violence, abuse and neglect against people with disabilities, which led to a recommendation of the formation of a Royal Commission into the abuse, neglect and violence perpetrated against people with disabilities. But it was still a long journey from there to here. Advocates have consistently and continually fought over the last 4 years, winning a election commitment from the ALP prior to the last election, and with great pushing, particularly from Senator Jordan Steele-John from the Australian Greens, a budget commitment to a record $500 million for the Royal Commission that we now see coming into place. The Royal Commission has already begun, but it's only in its early stages. So there have been some closed conversations within the sector that the Commission has been updating us about. There's now a draft accessibility strategy, and on September the 10th, there will be the first public session for this Royal Commission in Brisbane. So it's an exciting time for all of us, but we all have many more questions, I think, than answers at this point in time. Today, I'm very lucky to be joined on stage by 3 people who have been through some pretty diverse Royal Commission experiences. Dr. Meg Clement-Couzner from PWDA, who has experience with the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. Kristy McKellar, who has experience as both a professional working with governments and community sector organisations and as a victim survivor speaking to the Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence. And Gerard Brody, who's the CEO of the Consumer Action Law Centre and was very involved in the Royal Commission into Financial Services that recently wrapped up. And now, those are all pretty different Royal Commissions, focusing on very different things. I might start with you, Gerard, just to ask a little bit about the Royal Commission that you went through and what it was like, what it focused on.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be part of the panel today. Consumer Action Law Centre were very much involved in the Royal Commission into misconduct in the banking, financial services and superannuation industries that happened over the last 12 months. The Royal Commission really is, in a way, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to have an inquiry of this stature into an area of community concern or public policy. There had been many inquiries into banking and financial services over the year, but over the years and in the lead up to the Royal Commission, there'd been many recommendations. But the Royal Commission was, I guess, the highest form of inquiry and therefore attracted, the most attention and the most capacity to really result in change. The Banking Royal Commission was probably somewhat different to some of the other Royal Commissions we've heard about already, in the sense that it probably wasn't a bearing witness style Royal Commission. Some Royal Commissions have that focus on having individuals tell their stories and share, have that opportunity to talk directly to commissioners. And that was particularly the approach in the Royal Commission into institutional abuse, child sexual abuse, institutional responses of child sexual abuse. And I understand will be similar in this Royal Commission as well. The Financial Services Royal Commission, unfortunately, to the complaint of many, in fact, wasn't that style of Royal Commission. It was more of a policy Royal Commission. While there was stories of individuals and witnesses that gave evidence, there was only, I think, 23 people that gave individual evidence to that Royal Commission, which is not a very large number. My organisation got very much involved because we represented 6 people who gave evidence at the Commission, and we who were clients of our centre, and supported them through that process by helping them with understanding what the process would look like, and then helping them through engaging with the Royal Commission.
Okay. I might move to Meg next, because you've also experienced a Royal Commission that's, as Gerard just flagged, a little bit different in scope, but was much more personal for many of the people who gave evidence. And as a professional, what was that like?
Yeah, so I will say that the Child Abuse Royal Commission, as Gerard has mentioned, did involve, as we all know, more of a witness-bearing style of people telling their stories, being supported to tell their stories, and it really set the standards quite high, I think, for the accessibility of that Royal Commission. That being said, I would note that I think it's a great model for this Royal Commission because it was also so in-depth in terms of its policy work as well. We know that the results, or rather the reports that Royal Commission generated didn't come about by accident. It was through the ongoing engagement of advocates the whole way through that really drove the quality of the reports that Royal Commission was able to generate. But of course, it was also the witness bearing that took place. And I think anyone who's kind of had any engagement with that Royal Commission, or with indeed the commissioners on that Royal Commission, would just know that they were extremely personally affected by the stories that they heard. And we as a community know that people with disability were really overrepresented amongst the community of people who had experienced institutional child sexual abuse. So our community was kind of disproportionately represented in that space. But on the plus side, that Royal Commission did really kind of set the standard, I think, for accessibility. And I'm not sure without that Royal Commission having taken place as a model, whether we would really be where we are now with this Royal Commission.
Right, thank you. That's a good overview. And, you know, it's obvious that some Royal Commissions are going to affect people more personally than others. Not to say that the Banking Royal Commission didn't have a devastatingly personal effect on many people, but I think there's certainly a different depth and scope across those. And it's different again when you're a person with lived experience. Christie, you're both a victim survivor of family violence and a woman with a disability, and you contributed to the Family Violence Royal Commission here in Victoria. What was that like on a personal level?
It was very overwhelming, I think, but there was a lot. I think initially it was just, sadly to say, but I think it was shock that it was finally going to happen. And like Meg's point, you know, I would stress that, you know, we know that obviously there's a lot of deaths and things that come as a result of people finally actually going, oh, maybe, you know, we should pay attention now. But to Meg's point, I would have to say in terms of the Royal Commission into Family Violence, it was very much part of advocates for 30 plus years in the sector, if not more. So I'm 2 decades in the sector, and so prior to my lived experience, I'd been working as a professional in the sector of family violence, so working with children that had gone through horrific trauma and abuse, right through to women with disabilities. So for me, I think we had been advocating for us to be heard. And I feel like, you know, there was always some sort of reason as to why that wasn't, I guess there was no real channel, I would say, for talking or having some respectful conversations with people in power roles and policymakers. So that's sort of the history. There was a lot of that. So with the previous government, before the Andrews government took on the amazing task of the Royal Commission, it certainly had been brought up. It had been raised that there was a necessary need for a platform for victim survivors' voices to actually contribute and to be actually heard. So truly listen to make change. And then obviously, when the Andrew government announced it, it was a mix of emotions. So it was overwhelming, it was exciting, there was a whole lot of mixed emotions from everyone. So I guess the professional to personal, it was a tricky task because I had two hats. So I think at times, I just had to be really conscious of what hat I was wearing and put some sort of self-care and boundaries in place for myself as well.
And Christie, when the Royal Commission was first announced, and you're going through that state of overwhelm of, oh my God, this is finally happening. Because you wear so many different hats, did you have a sense of what the process would be for a Royal Commission and what that looked like?
I didn't at the time, no. I knew what I wanted to say and I had a lot to say on it, as did thousands of other people. But it wasn't until I'd been working with policymakers with the previous government, and through my role I was lucky enough that they basically had passed that on. So Daniel Andrews had engaged me to have an actual one-on-one conversation. So that's really, for me, probably what informed me, is what it would look like, how it would feel, what it would be like. So I I was lucky in the sense to be able to pass that on in terms of a professional way, what the professional's role would be and what it would look like, versus that of a victim survivor. So being able to have, I think, that sort of one-on-one conversation enabled me to, I guess, highlight what supports might need to be in place for that process to happen and what would be the best way. So there was sort of a lot of discussion. There was a collaboration day, which I think was amazing to happen. So the late Minister Fiona Richardson and I held a collaboration day. So what we did is we had, there was one for professionals and victim survivors, and it was just before it even kicked off, it was a way to say, let's all digest it together and let's talk about what it might look like, what it would entail, what are ways that people could, I guess, partake in it if it's not in person, and what are the other ways where people can feel safe to express what they need or what they want to be heard. So that collaboration day I really feel was hugely beneficial and what sort of set the scene to move forward.
Meg, in the Child Sex Abuse Royal Commission, you mentioned before that there were a high number of people with disability who came forward. And so obviously engagement of people with disability and doing that well was something that PWDA and others in the sector had to think about. What do you think came out of that process that worked well, and what do you think could work differently in terms of support?
Yeah, that's a really big question, but also a really important one. And I think it's something that we, as an advocacy sector, we have so little time and we're so underfunded at the moment, and yet there are these kind of big questions about the integrity of the Royal Commission that it's really important that we get right in the lead up to this Royal Commission as it starts to roll on and get going. So I'll start by talking a little bit about what I think worked really well in the Child Abuse Royal Commission, just from my organisation's perspective, People with Disability Australia. And I know that at some point during this chat we're going to talk a little bit about kind of what the lessons are that we can take from that as well. So what I would say, I think, about the Child Abuse Royal Commission that worked well is that there was a really comprehensive approach to funding user organisations and organisations of, I guess, consumers, for want of a better word, but disability representative organisations, for the work that kind of needed to be done to engage people with disability in this Royal Commission. So recognising also that some people with disability, whilst people with disability are more vulnerable if they are in institutional settings to abuse, also many people have a disability as a result of child sexual abuse, institutional child sexual abuse. So there are kind of, I guess, two categories of people with disability who were really affected by the Child Abuse Royal Commission, and thus, like, really important that the Royal Commission took a thorough approach to engagement. Some of the things that we were able to do really successfully in that Royal Commission, and I know it definitely wasn't just PWDA, were that it was important that people were able to understand, I guess, that the child sexual abuse that the Royal Commission was talking about was something that might actually relate to them. So one thing that PWDA was able to do there was run, we called it training, but it was really more peer education in a way. Lots of group sessions co-facilitated by people with disability themselves, with other people with disability, and those sessions were I'm going to say in the guise of, but really were about like healthy relationships, what those look like, what healthy sexual relationships look like. But through those sessions, what we found was that at every single session there was a disclosure. Because people, once they started to understand and have conversations about what those healthy relationships might look like, what consensual sexual relationships might look like, people started to understand that what they had experienced actually didn't look like that. And so funding of that kind of peer engagement was really important to the success of that Royal Commission. And I think, there's so much shame. There's so much shame. Our community lives with so much shame around the abuse that people experience. And so breaking down some of that is absolutely critical, and we can't assume that, and the government really shouldn't assume, that people are just there ready to tell their stories, because that's not, why would that be the case? There's so much silence around this. And what the advocacy community has managed to do, thank goodness, through campaigning for this Royal Commission, has been to break some of that silence, but there's still so much work to do, and they will need to fund that peer support. And then there was things like all of the policy work and all of the individual advocacy for people who did actually get to the point where they said, yeah, we're going to go through and go forward and tell our stories. So I know I've talked a lot there, but hopefully that sort of starts to answer, I guess, what it is that the government needs to provide in terms of supports, and what we already know that has been successful in the past.
So we talked a bit about the support and kind of the pre-steps in getting people engaged with Royal Commissions. Gerard, Royal Commissions can be quite technical in the way that they work. That, you have different ways to engage with them, and each of those has their advantages and disadvantages. You've got hearings, you've got submissions, sometimes you might have community forums. Are there particular things that you learnt from the from the Banking Royal Commission about what the advantages and disadvantages are of engaging in different parts of the process?
Yeah. I mean, when the Royal Commission established, it wasn't a process that we'd been through before either, and many people in my working life. So it was very new. We were learning as we were going. We did talk to others that had been involved in Royal Commissions before, but as I said, they can be quite different. The first way we got involved in the Royal Commission, I actually received a letter from the Commissioner. He'd only just been appointed, and the letter he sent me was received on Christmas Eve, I remember, and inviting a written submission in 2 weeks hence, with all the issues that are affecting, all the issues around misconduct in the finance sector. That letter had gone to all the other financial institutions like the one we're in today. And of course they complied and provided their evidence. But the difference that we could make is that we could make our contribution public. So we published our submission as soon as we submitted it, which there was a lot of media interest in this Royal Commission. And so that generated, I guess, an opportunity for us to generate a narrative about what we wanted to see the Royal Commission focus on and what opportunity for change there was. So one of the lessons I learnt very on was engaging in not just through the direct process of the Royal Commission, but more broadly in a community discussion, particularly through the media, is really important and helpful, and particularly was during the Banking Royal Commission. So, for example, later on, when we had our clients give evidence, we would also work with them and support them to be interviewed by journalists and have their stories told, and also not just through the media, but directly with some of the key decision makers as well. So whether that's the regulators, whether that's directly with the senior leaders in the institutions themselves that are being examined, or the politicians. And I think that was one reflection that I had. The voice of our clients, the voice of people affected by misconduct was the most powerful, and was what changed people's frame of mind, change people's views. I think before the Royal Commission, even during the time, a lot of the people in the banking sector thought, oh, why do we need this? It's not going to achieve anything. We know best about how to run the system. But I actually think the voices of individuals telling their stories shifted a lot of that. And people at the big banks today are actually much more interested in hearing directly by people affected by their practices. And I think that's a significant win, let alone the changes to laws and policy. The other way which we, of course, did influence the submission is through written submissions. That's an important part of the process. So there was various hearing rounds, and at the end of each round, people were invited to write written submissions. That is, I think, an important opportunity to have your view and your evidence on the table. It is the Royal Commission. It's a quasi-legal process. It feels a bit very legal. There's lawyers, there's barristers, but it's not a court. So there is no sort of requirement to be as formal as a court or to worry about the legalese when you write submissions. Anything that you provide as input will be considered by the Royal Commission. The other tip I would give is to engage closely with the counsel assisting the Royal Commission. So people may have heard of that term, counsel assisting. Who are they? So usually a Royal Commission will appoint a Royal Commissioner or a panel of Royal Commissioners, and then they appoint senior counsel assisting. So that's a senior barrister who is appointed to assist the Royal Commission in their inquiries. And they will take the role in interviewing or examining witnesses. They will take the role in sort of summing up potential findings or things that the Royal Commission could consider as it goes about its work. And so I think that us developing a relationship with them and the other lawyers that assisted them was really important to also influence their thinking, both with the conduct of the hearings and later with policy work as well.
That's really, really comprehensive, Gerard. Thank you very much. When you were talking about media and the stories that were kind of generated, it seemed like every other day there was a story about the Banking Royal Commission when it was running. And so there was obviously a huge amount of media interest in people's stories. But clearly when individuals come forward and they disclose, that has an impact on them. And also directing the media would be quite tricky. How did you manage those two things?
Yeah, it is a challenge. I mean, it's something that at Consumer Action Law Centre we've done for a long time is recognise that particularly in the areas of consumer rights, people telling their stories publicly is the way to get some change and even to resolve an individual problem. But you have to do it in a way that supports that person, so it's a positive experience for them and not a negative one. And unfortunately, we have had experiences where journalists do the wrong thing or treat people badly or put them in a corner. And so what we would do, of course, is to develop relationships with journalists and work out what story they want to tell and help them frame that story before introducing them to someone that could help be the subject of that story and tell their story. And that way we know that it was going to be safe and they would be empowered through that process rather than sort of taken advantage of. We would also have to do very practical things around our clients, particularly the ones that were giving evidence in the Royal Commission, because as you said, there was a lot of media attention. So this was front page news for days on end after those hearings were occurring. So we did practical things like shut down your social media, encourage our clients to turn off their Facebook, because we knew journalists would be trying to get their contact details and be trying to contact them directly at times where it didn't suit them or at times where they felt that they weren't in control. There's a range of things working directly with the media, but also providing practical support. The third thing I might say is we try and do this more generally with our media work, is to put people in touch with others that have done it before and let them hear from others who have had their stories told in the media, so they can understand what it's going to be like, what the impact was, what it was, and help them, I guess, understand that doing so not only helps them, but it results in change for others. And I think that's what can be most empowering for people.
Meg, when you were involved in the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, you were and PWD were obviously assisting people with disabilities who might want to tell their stories publicly. How did you control that narrative? Because the understanding in the media of the different ways abuse can look and be for people with disabilities is still pretty limited, I would imagine.
I think there are I think it's getting better, but I think there are still some really limited understandings of the experiences of people with disability in the media. I'll provide the caveat that I joined People with Disability Australia towards the tail end of the Child Abuse Royal Commission. But that being said, speaking from the kind of institutional knowledge that has been passed on to me, I think we have sometimes defaulted in the past to being, slightly more protective and having staff perhaps do some of the media work, whilst also there are people who are more confident to speak to the media. When I was speaking earlier, I suppose I was speaking about people who might not necessarily recognise that their experiences would constitute institutional child sexual abuse. On the other end of that, and the fact that we'll need to do that work again of engagement in this Royal Commission, reaching out to people who won't necessarily be coming forward immediately with the kind of recognition that they have experienced violence, abuse, neglect or exploitation. That being said, we know that there are people on the other end of the spectrum who are very open about being survivors, who know that the wrong thing has been done to them and want to speak out so that it doesn't happen again to other people. We know that there are advocates in our community like that. Some of them are right here today. So we have been working on kind of how we're going to support those people to speak out during the Royal Commission, but also be, somewhat protected in the way that Gerard was describing. We know that there's a real hunger from journalists for first-person stories that will kind of illustrate the experiences of people with disability who have experienced violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation. And so at the moment, what our communications manager is doing, I suppose, is putting together a bit of a package of material about how we're going to work with people to get confident in telling their story in a way that's safe for them. And also, on the flip side, she's trying to work with some trusted journalists that we respect who will be able to tell that story in a way that provides dignity to the person, which is so important, we know. That being said, you can't always control the narrative. And we know that that's a risk that we take with pushing campaigns like this forward. PWDA and others here have obviously concluded that that's a worthwhile risk to take because of the potential progress that we can make with a Royal Commission like that. But I would never sort of say that it doesn't come with risks.
Yeah. And so just to follow up on that, you talked about the work that your communications team are doing.
Some of you know Elle Gibbs, I'm sure.
Yes, they do fabulous work. Hello on Twitter. We, as a sector, a lot of individual advocates and some of the smaller organisations don't necessarily have comms expertise, but might have people who are keen to speak out. Is there room for organisations to come together and coordinate on this, do you think?
Yeah, I'm sure there is. And, I'm sure it's a topic that we're going to get to, but something that we're really struggling with at PWDA, and I know everyone else is struggling here as well, we're doing all of this on the smell of an oily rag. We're already kind of doing all of this additional work with the Royal Commission, and we actually haven't seen a dime of extra funding yet. So what I want to know, I think it's fantastic that we collaborate. I think we all need to support each other, and I'm pretty confident that that's something we all want to do. But where's the money? Where's the money? We need to see some money from government to support this, to support and to recognise that people need to tell their stories safely. So it's important that there's funding, not just for that individual pointy-end advocacy, but for this kind of work where we're supporting people to tell their stories with a bit of a safety net there, supported by their advocacy and representative organisations, and with the people around them who are going to be able to help them do it in a safe way that's going to work, that's going to educate the community. So this sort of stuff doesn't keep happening.
Yeah. Christie, as a person who wore did that tricky thing of wearing many, many hats, you talked to me before, we were having a bit of a chat, about how, sometimes you have to choose what you disclose where. For people who might be thinking themselves in this audience, oh, I wear many hats, or I'm supporting other people in our community who do, what are some of the considerations that they might have to think about?
I think, I just wanted to backtrack, if I can, just for 1 sec. I just wanted to point out in terms of when we talk about telling a story, I just wanted to point out from the Royal Commission that I was involved with in family violence, I think people very much underestimated the power of storytelling. What it has done is changed immensely, and the Royal Commission really I don't think realised that at the beginning, and there was a real need to train media. So we actually held a day where we trained media on sensitive reporting, sensitive language, what us as survivors, want to hear, and how to respect our story. And I think it's also about knowing your rights, so that it's okay to ask what your rights are, because there is rights, and you are able to request a draft. You are able to look over that content, and yes, at the end, there may be some changes that we're not always happy with, but you're looking at around possibly 80 to 90% at least is right, it is correct. And there's always that risk of, exacerbating the perpetrator. There's so many elements to it that people that haven't been through it just wouldn't understand. So I think having that platform, and then what basically fell from that was the creation of VSAC, which I'm sure a lot of you probably do know what that is, but Victim Survivor Advisory Council was a recommendation that got put in place because of that. So that was an actual platform for not only speaking out safely, but having people that were comfortable to do so. And then, obviously that consisted of various people making up that entirety of the platform in terms of having different disabilities, different cultural backgrounds. So, trying to make sure that everyone's story was actually able to be told in a way that was safe and comfortable. So I just wanted to let you know there are ways to, I think, incorporate that into a Royal Commission and have a platform for that.
It's really important for individuals to be able to control their own story, isn't it? And that's one of the key considerations when you come forward to disclose. You want to be able to be assured that you're going to have some power in the situation, yeah?
Yeah, and back to your point, sorry. So in terms of, are you asking, in terms of the different hats and what to disclose when?
Well, yes. So you were a professional, but you also had your own personal experience.
Yes.
Sometimes I think for people who are in professional roles, it can be hard to take that professional hat off, especially when you see other people around you who need support as well. How did you find that experience?
I actually found it, at the start it was a little bit daunting, and I think I had to sort of figure out where the boundaries were, but to be honest, I think that's what I referred to before about it being powerful. I don't think I really realised that I was really uniquely positioned compared to a lot of people that were either a professional versus also a victim survivor. And for me it was about joining the two. So I felt like as a professional, until my experience, I'd been around 10 years in the sector, and I sort of thought, once again, it's not that I was immune from the encounter, but I thought I'd be able to spot it or define it. And I couldn't even define, to be honest, that it was abuse that was happening to me in the first place. So again, it just goes to show that it can happen to anyone. You're not immune from those encounters, even though I had this background in psychology and sociology and everything that I'd done. So for me, it was about joining the two and not being, I think, too worried about what people thought. So I think for me, it was about reflecting and thinking at the time, we're doing not a bad job. We're kind of on top of things and we're supporting people the way they need. The system's working okay. And then when I had my lived experience, it all came falling down around me, and I realised that the system was completely unreliable, inconsistent, It didn't provide justice for people that were brave enough to tell their story and stand up for justice. So for me, it was interesting that I think I was able to reflect and talk to the professionals about that and sort of weave in my story. And I guess when those changes were needed, it actually was a strength that I could draw on to say that won't work and challenge it in a respectful way. And when people would say, well, why wouldn't that work? I was able to say, because this is what happens, or this would be the outcome of that. So I feel like, to be honest, I felt, it's not for everyone, but I felt that I could be transparent. I didn't feel that people looked at me differently, so I sort of was able to balance it quite well. And I think when the time called for it, even in a professional setting, I could say from having a learned experience, this is going to be the outcome, and therefore I don't think that's a good pathway to take. And I think it's about the whole creation of not the system and people fitting into it. It's about learning how we need to respond to people's needs, and we create a system around that.
Which is a great statement. You must have found, though, that you had to engage in some self-care as someone who was, presenting from a personal perspective, but also straddling those two roles. How did you find accessing that?
Yeah, I think also with my background, I was a bit of, I'll be fine, and I played the game of, oh, she'll be right, I'll be fine, I've got psychology on my side, and I wasn't okay. And it was quite confronting. And I think going back to Gerard's point before, it was just little things. Like for me, I did, it's not for everyone, but I did choose to press charges. It was a very difficult and terrifying decision. It was 2.5 years of a court process that was, pretty horrendous actually. So for me, going back into a setting where even though it wasn't technically a court-like setting, it was a court-like feeling. And to walk in and think I'd be okay, I was struck with a little bit of feeling quite, uncomfortable, I guess. It sort of brought back a little bit of the memories of what I'd been through. And even though I felt safer and my perpetrator wasn't there to face, it still was something I don't think I prepared for. So I think it's really important to prepare for triggers that might happen. But for me, I was very lucky. I've got a lot of good friends and family support I could draw on, making sure, that I didn't shut down and that I had a conversation with them about it, and also seeking, I think, debriefs when it was offered. And I think the Royal Commission that I was involved in were very good at that. So whether that was an internal process at the workplace that they could support you with and you felt more comfortable, but even if you had someone that previously you had sought counselling or support from, the Royal Commission would look at linking you in and actually covering the cost of that for you to do. Or there was a choice of obviously externally who they were providing. And so there was always opportunities to access debriefs. So I think it's about, when the time comes, when you need it. And I think when things are triggered, when post-traumatic stress starts kicking in, and it's those things that you can feel and the signs, just your appetite, your sleep patterns, you start to realise and pick up on it, and that's the time when obviously, you do need to debrief. So I think it's absolutely critical for self-care. But I feel like also we shouldn't minimise the power of storytelling and the healing process of that. I think it can be really cathartic, and I think a lot of people felt that way. I think a lot of people had waited decades and years to tell their story and to be validated and actually feel that, they weren't just minimised and they were believed, it was validated, they got a response, or they received justice. So, and I think a lot of people found that very healing, which I did myself. I found that really helped me to sort of, I think, close that chapter and move forward when I got through those sort of pathways that I needed to.
That's really positive and really affirming, I think, for us at Day Dot to hear, but there can be healing in these kind of processes. So thank you for sharing that. We do know, though, that sometimes Royal Commission processes are not so affirming. Every process and every opportunity for individual voice and opportunity for systemic change has its flaws. Gerard, what were the things, now that you look back on the Banking Royal Commission, that you think, these were questions that didn't get resolved very well, or these were processes that didn't work as well as they could?
Well, there were a number. The Banking Royal Commission was, in the scheme of things, a very short enterprise. It went for less than 12 months from where to go, really. So it really, and what we're talking about is a sector of the economy that makes up, I think, 20% of all purchases. So it's really a significant area to focus on in just 12 months. So they really didn't have the chance to look at the scheme of consumer harm and some of the problems in the finance sector. And I think that was a problem. That said, there is something about the momentum associated with a targeted, sort of focused commission that can, deliver a report and then produce change. And as I said, I think the change has come not just through the formal recommendations, but within the culture of the finance sector and the community more broadly about what they expect. And a key example of that was they have established now a new ombudsman scheme in the finance sector called the Australian Financial Complaints Authority. They've received double the amount of complaints than the previous schemes used to receive. So people are more empowered to use those systems to get an outcome, and I think that's really positive. I guess that the other limitation of the Royal Commission goes back to what I said before, was that it did only hear from 23 individuals, and I think that was a missed opportunity to hear in much great depth, or give alternative ways for people to share their stories. The Royal Commission did accept written submissions from anyone, and I know there were thousands of submissions, and the Royal Commissioner himself said that he read all of those submissions. But I don't think that's the same, and I think many people in the community were dissatisfied with that. And in fact, I know they were, because they would come to an organisation like mine because we were seen to be closely engaged with the Commission and complain directly about it to see what else we could do. Which was, and I spent hours with people talking to them about that and about the challenges they faced, and they had lost life savings, or they'd been put into loads and loads of debt, and they felt like they didn't have the opportunity to tell their story. So I think that was a missed opportunity. What we tried to do was to give them other ways to tell those stories, advise them about the other options there are to resolve complaints or issues they had. But I think that many people still felt dissatisfied. One of the recommendations from the Royal Commission, though, was to sort of reopen past complaints processes and look back. They're calling it the look back approach, where even if you had a complaint before that had not been resolved satisfactorily, you can go back now and have it looked at again by the Australian Financial Complaints Authority. So that gives another opportunity for people that were dissatisfied by the Royal Commission.
That's a really good recommendation to have coming out of it. You talked about the quick rate of change that's occurred. So the recommendations were put to government, and then those have started to be implemented very, very quickly, which isn't probably always the case with Royal Commissions. Has that been a challenge for the community sector in your space, Gerard?
Yeah, look, there's a couple of things there. So the Royal Commission handed down its report on the 1st of February this year. There were 72 recommendations, and the government immediately responded to say that they would implement all of those recommendations, and regulators and the industry associations that had recommendations relating to them did the same. What was fascinating, though, was a quick backflip that occurred in a space of a month. There was one of the key problems the Royal Commission into Finance identified was self-interest, money, profit, greed. We heard about that in the newspapers. That even though these banks and financial institutions had duties to customers, that would be overlooked when they could make a quick buck. And so one of the recommendations from the Royal Commission was trying to address that, focused on mortgage brokers, and to change the way mortgage brokers are remunerated and take away commissions. We all thought that was a really significant change that would actually mean that mortgage brokers were more likely to act in your interest rather than just be a salesperson. Unfortunately, within a month, as I said, the mortgage broking sector had campaigned very effectively, and it was a lead up to a federal election, and they secured a backflip from the government over that recommendation. And so I think the lesson out of that was, nothing's certain, nothing's assured when it comes to politics. And you have to continue to put the pressure to ensure recommendations are implemented. That all said, now it's been 6 months ago since they've handed it down, the government and the election's sort of out of the way, and the government's got some clear space. It's very clear that they're now very much focused on implementing those remaining recommendations and as soon as possible, and they've actually brought forward the time frame associated with that, which does create stress for or community advocates in terms of trying to provide input into the implementation of those changes. With many submissions and processes with government inquiries about the details of particular legal changes, it's going to be a real challenge, I think, to make sure that that's done well.
Excuse me, may I ask a question of the
We're going to have questions in a few moments, so we'll just finish up with the last two panellists giving their closing thoughts, and then we'll have some questions. So hold it for just a moment, and we'll be back to you. Meg, you obviously the process of healing might have been an option for some people coming out of the Child Sex Abuse Royal Commission, and there was also scope for great change. But were there other things that you look back on now, and knowing that you came in at the tail end, where you go, well, we could have done that better, or the sector could have lobbied differently?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I guess what I've thought about in preparation for this panel was a little bit about, what were the lessons that we took from the Child Abuse Royal Commission, acknowledging that was a really successful and well-respected Royal Commission. What made it so, and what do we need to avoid in order to have a successful Royal Commission this time around? Fully acknowledging that it's a different context, different political context as well. And I think I looked back at some of the submissions that not I, but people with Disability Australia put forward during that Child Abuse Royal Commission, and some of the advocacy, person-to-person advocacy that we were doing at that time. And something that was really clear to me was that we, PWDA, but also the whole disability advocacy and representative organisations, were on them the entire time to recognise the importance of changes, recommendations that were going to include people with disability and benefit people with disability. It wasn't like it was just a magic Royal Commission that was so fantastic all the way through with no effort from the sector. Yeah, we had a great outcome from that Royal Commission, really good reports, but I go back and I see their consultation report into criminal justice, changes that were needed to the criminal justice system. And they just really failed to include the recommendations that people with disability would need in that consultation paper. It was a good Royal Commission, but there were still huge gaps. So PWDA, and I'm sure many others, responded and said, hey, you've missed all of this stuff that people with disability need to have equal access to the law, equal access to justice. And the example that I'll give will be pre-recorded evidence for people with disability. Now, without keeping on that Royal Commission that whole time, we wouldn't have had that kind of what we look back on as that respected Child Abuse Royal Commission. And I'm thinking about Gerard's point re brokers. We know that we need to be really on guard about what government and what service providers are going to want out of this Royal Commission. They're going to want recommendations that are going to be more beneficial to their interests. We know that we're the ones that represent people with disability, and so we have to be making sure that we're guarding against that the whole time. I want to quickly acknowledge that I didn't personally acknowledge that we're on Aboriginal land at the moment. And in saying that, I want to kind of think about the fact that we're still waiting so many years later for Aboriginal deaths in custody, the recommendations that came out of that Royal Commission to be implemented. We know that coroners make those same recommendations over and over and over again, and those recommendations don't get taken up. very simple recommendations that wouldn't be hugely expensive, like removing things that might, lead to people self-harming in prison cells. These things aren't expensive, but they haven't been taken up. So we know that we need to keep on the government the whole time about the changes that we need to make sure that people with disability are safe, that they're able to make choices that keep them safe and, affect their lives for the better. That's what I think we need to do.
Yeah, great.
But we need funding to do it.
Yeah, so that really important point about influencing decision makers that Gerard made earlier as well through individual stories, not just focusing on the Royal Commission, making sure that the political influence stays true as well. As the lived experience on this panel, Christie, I'm going to give you the last word on reflection. What do you think needs to happen for a Royal Commission, like the Family Violence Royal Commission, to do that really well, to centre the voices of people who have lived experience?
Yeah, look, I think when obviously the Royal Commission had been announced, it obviously was a very fast-paced process. It's very hard for a lot of people that have been waiting so long to digest what was actually happening. But I feel like they had said exactly what you're referring to, that, it would be that the victim survivors were going to be at the centre. They were going to be at the centre of everything. And I feel like when it first kicked off, that wasn't really the case. So I feel like, passing on, any knowledge and lessons would be about really cementing that human-centred practice. It needs to have a lens over it around victim survivors and their voices are the voices that can make the change. So I think that's really key. Also, I feel like with Royal Commissions, the meetings that came as, I guess, a consequence of what needed to be discussed was so many. It was so overwhelming. As much as they were very much needed, I think the lesson learnt was the effectiveness of that. So having 45 people in a room at a meeting for an hour and a half, what's actually going to be achieved, what's actually going to be heard. So I think that was a lesson as well that, was sort of, I guess, halfway through, people were starting to recognise, as much as we needed diverse voices, how could we actually structure it a bit differently, because people weren't being heard, the changes weren't being recorded. The other thing too was the recommendations. So, the disappointment, I think, that came of wanting certain recommendations, and when you didn't get it, I just want to reiterate that there was room to move. So as much as I remember glaring at Daniel Andrews across the room very clearly, he probably remembers it too, I wanted the magistrates and judges to be trained. I wanted that to be mandated, and I didn't get up on that one. Obviously, there was a lot of other amazing things in terms of having to mandate some training around domestic and family violence and defining it in the first place, because I think that spiritual, the financial, children from utero being abused, a lot of that was overlooked. So I know I sort of was in this room with these books this big when we realised what it was going to be, and I looked straight away and saw it wasn't there, and he said, "There's room to move, there's room to move." So for me, it was about, is there actually room to move? And as it happened, I think that's the push. I would say that I learnt from our Royal Commission, I would pass on, is that, to keep persisting with that, because there was opportunity to create it. So for example, I then ended up on a magistrates task force was created. So there is room to move. So I think the learning is to keep pushing where there's gaps, and also the timelines. I think for the Royal Commission that I was involved as a victim survivor, like, you want those timelines to be adhered to and met. You want that to happen. So I think the realistic outcome for me was realising that it wasn't going to happen by the time set, whether it was a year, 2 months, whatever the recommendations were. So it was really important that we had an implementation system where we had someone that was sort of obviously removed from the Royal Commission. So we had someone that was monitoring it. They were monitoring the timeline. So that would be an important lesson, that I think people need to spend more time having feedback with someone that is external around those timelines. And I think the need of that and how important it is to keep continuing rolling it out, because once we had those conversations, which was very late on, which, if we can stop that happening for this Royal Commission, to have those discussions earlier to ensure that people are kept and held to account on timeframes. Yeah.
That's a very good point for us to close on. I think, knowing that we are heading into a very long process ahead of us, that it's been a significant victory to get a Royal Commission, as it always is and has been for all of these Royal Commissions. But we have plenty of work through the Royal Commission and then plenty of work after it to keep us well and truly occupied. But that being said, we are at day dot and lots of people in the audience have questions. So we have about 20 minutes now for questions. I am partially blind and partially deaf, which is great when you're doing public speaking, but less helpful when it comes to questions. So Wayne, I believe you've been pressed into service to do roving mic for us. And I might get Wayne to verbally indicate when he's with someone who has a question.
Yes, absolutely. So from the lectern, I'm going to exercise my questioning, asking powers, as any MC is allowed to do.
Speaking of holding people accountable in Royal Commission.
And if people do have questions, firstly, can we just give thanks to the panel for their insight, for sharing what a unique opportunity we have with this Royal Commission. We will become a stronger, more resilient community when we are brave enough to shine a light on the darkest parts of our communities and respond effectively, and we are all responsible for that. So if I can just get a show of hands if people have a question, and my roving micers will come to you. And if I can just ask, once you have the microphone, if you can introduce yourself and tell us where you're from, and then the panel will answer your question. Do we have... Yep.
Thank you.
So,
Good afternoon. Christine Aegis, Action for People with Disability. We were the first regional advocacy agency funded in New South Wales. I'm into my 4th decade of provision of advocacy for people with disability, and have had involvement in the Royal Commissions previously. In the domestic violence, I supported people to come forward into that commission to tell of their experiences. Into the abuse of children, I supported a number of people with disability and their families to come forward into there, including one mother who carried the urn of her son's ashes in to make her statement, a boy who had died in care from abuse. Unfortunately, with that commission, I found some flaws with it. There were time limitations placed on people telling their story. We need to absolutely ensure that doesn't occur with this Royal Commission, because some people with disability will need extended time. The other point that I'd like to make, and I also, whilst there's lived experience as a person with disability and also in the abuse of children, I did have a lived experience of a highly abused childhood. I did not visit that on the situations that I was supporting or the people I was supporting, because each situation is individual. Now, neither of those commissions afforded any funding for advocates. That was all done in voluntary time. Whilst I'm most appreciative of the $9 million out of the $52 million budget being allocated for advocacy, it's only being allocated to Commonwealth-funded advocacy agencies. And across Australia, $9 million will not go far. The advocacy agencies that are only state government funded will have to do all of that work. For example, at Action, we have 70 people who need support in taking their experiences forward, and considerable. And I believe that out of some of those, some formal legal actions will need to proceed. But there is no funding for us to do that. So what I want to ask the panel is, do you really believe that that $9 million nationwide is going to go anywhere near 50% of what is needed to truly support all people who need to take their experience forward?
Yes, I was going to ask Meg, but I think just to say, this goes back to some of the points that the panel has made about constant accountability, both in terms of your point around accessibility of time for people to have their stories heard, but also around the adequacy of funding. So Meg, what do you think about the level of funding?
Hi, Christine. Fellow New South Welsh woman here. So in terms of funding, yeah, I mean, I think we've all kind of heard the chatter that it's the NDAP organisations that are going to get a funding boost to do advocacy in this Royal Commission. And I'm pretty clear, I think in PWDA is pretty clear that the numbers that are being talked about are patently inadequate. We need funding not just for individual advocacy, as is being talked about at the moment. We need it for systemic advocacy, that policy work that I was talking about that was so critical in the Child Abuse Royal Commission. We need it for the peer outreach that I was talking about earlier. We need it for family advocacy. We need it for all of the kinds of advocacy that people in this room provide, and it needs to be nationwide, and it needs to be available to remote communities. It needs, in particular, to be available to CALD communities and to Aboriginal communities, because we know that people are disproportionately affected. PWDA has been advocating on this pretty strongly. We've put out a position paper that may not be up on our website yet, but we have been kind of doing that internally, and we've been arguing for all of those things. I think we are maybe, touch wood, slowly starting to see some movement in that space, but just an increase in the NDAP funding, absolutely not. It's not adequate.
Thanks,
okay,
Mary.
I think there would be probably agreement in the room about this. Is there anyone else out there with a question or a comment?
We do have another question. We'll just get the microphone to the gentleman. And if you could just introduce yourself.
My name is Greg Axton. I'm pretty well known in the advocacy sector in Melbourne, but my question, as an very old advocate that's been fighting for LGBT disability rights and other issues, do you think the media will really be interested?
So can somebody please repeat that question? I was having trouble hearing you, Greg, sorry.
So if I can repeat the question, and I'll paraphrase, but please correct me if I get it wrong. The question was around LGBTIQ advocacy for people with disability, and whether the panellist felt that the media would be interested in covering stories that impact that community. Did I capture the question?
Yeah. I think I might throw this open to the panel, but I'll start with Gerard, because you have done a lot of media coordination as part of your Royal Commission. Do you think that it's harder to get intersectional issues or really niche issues up, like the intersection of disability and LGBTIQ issues in abuse?
This area isn't my experience, but I would say that journalists and the media are interested in a wide variety of issues, and they're actually often interested in something that's a little bit different, that's not just the usual story. So something that falls outside the mainstream may actually pique the interest of a journalist. And I think what's most impactful is telling, as we've talked before, the human story. If there is somebody that's willing to share their story and it's connected with a bigger ask or a bigger systemic issue, that I think is when the media will be most interested in covering a story.
Well, speaking from PWDA's perspective, it's something, the intersection of disability and LGBTI issues is something we do quite a bit of work on. I think that it is a tricky one to get the community to understand the intersection of those issues, but I will say that I think there's some hope in the space, in part because of the successful advocacy we've done around the terms of reference. So the terms of reference does refer to a number of kind of more marginalised or doubly marginalised groups within the disability community. In particular, we were really happy to have worked with Intersex Human Rights Australia to get people of intersex experience, people who have intersex experiences, to be listed in that terms of reference as a group that have been marginalised and do experience significant abuse and violence and breaches of their human rights. So we're quite happy about that inclusion. But I think then the question will be, coming back to what I've been talking about all along, will be kind of keeping on that issue and making sure that it's adequately recognised in the Royal Commission. Getting to your point about media, I mean, I hate to think that it's just a niche issue, because it is something that really affects many, many, many people. And I think in particular, something that is important to recognise in the disability services space is that, you know, we come from a history with a sector where there are a lot of religious providers, and where people with disability are really dehumanised and their sexuality is not recognised. They are seen as eternal children. And so it is really important to recognise that abuse can take place at that kind of really tricky triangulation of issues. I'd like to think that we can, try and keep on that and be more successful, but remains to be seen, I suppose. I think a really key distinction that I'll just make quickly is that this Royal Commission is not just about children. And so it's really important that we're recognising that people are whole people, that adults with disability, you know, they have sexuality, that can be a core part of people's identity. And so I think as much as I would say that I recognise the Child Abuse Royal Commission as an example that we can hold up that did some really great things, it's really important that we make the distinction from that Royal Commission that this is actually about all people with disability. It's not just about children with disability, and we recognise those intersections that Greg has flagged. So thanks for that question. I think it's an important one.
And Christie, just to follow up with you, because you were part of the Family Violence Royal Commission, and you would have seen a lot of individuals going through that with different, you know, intersections, but the community might consider niche. So thank you for that pick up, Meg. Yeah, not niche. Do you think that Royal Commissioners need and the media need particular skills to respond to that?
Look, I do, but I also feel like there has been a lot of that work going on. So over 4 years, I feel like there has been a lot of training, there has been a lot of talk, there has been a lot of collaboration with Task Force. And as I mentioned before about being able to sort of get through the maze of it all and be in a group with the Chief Magistrate, things that I could leverage. This is the same for, you know, Indigenous communities. We're looking at, so LGBTIQ, we have every representative on VSAC that I was talking about before. So these voices are there for a reason. And I feel like, to be honest, disability has been such a huge part of the Family Violence Royal Commission that I feel like it's a little bit of a blueprint, and also we would welcome you to tap into our resources. I feel like there's a really good opportunity for us that we know media and what they want to cover. And yes, sometimes media, their intention possibly isn't always the right intention, but it's about when we know there's an opportunity to get something highlighted, to have a story told. It's about, again, finding those trusted media outlets that we know we have. We know the journalists write extremely well in sensitive language. So, for instance, you know, obviously in VSAC we do have a member that channels everything about it. He's got a very big and loud voice. And yeah, Russell's very, I guess, his own advocate. He'll go and crusade a lot of things as well as in the space that we have. So I feel that, you know, there is a possibility for us to sort of extend those contacts we have and what's happening with rainbow training, for example, through workplaces. There's a lot happening as a result of our Royal Commission that we could help, I feel, as well.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you all for your considered responses.
Great. We've got another question from the audience.
More questions?
More questions, but important questions, right? I think this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to respond to significant issues. So over to you.
Thanks. Julie Phillips, Disability Discrimination Legal Service. My question is to anyone really, and in fact each of you might have a different answer because you've been involved in different commissions, but it's about the quality of recommendations. And I ask that in the in the context of having, in the last 10 years, looked at a lot of recommendations from parliamentary inquiries and Human Rights Commission reports into different issues to do with disabilities, some recommendations being so broad and vague that the organisation to whom the recommendation was directed at has easily met the recommendation and done nothing. For example, review a policy, and all someone needs to do is look at it and then tick, yes, we did that. And of course, there's a huge difference between a hard-hitting, very specific recommendation that can't be wiggled out of. So I'm not quite sure of the order of the commissions that you've been involved in, except the banking one was just recently, obviously. But I just wondered if you had any comment about the quality of recommendations in the commissions you were involved in, and whether you felt that had an adverse or positive effect on the whole issue, which was the reason for the commission.
So I think we'll start, that's a fantastic question, Julie. I think we'll start with Gerard again. And sorry to keep putting you on the spot, Gerard, but...
more than fine. I think it is probably a bit difficult for me to say because many of them are yet to be implemented. So I kind of can't really say whether they're going to meet the purpose of them in the implementation. I think one thing I would say is that the Royal Commissioner did take a focus on the need to deliver outcomes. He was less interested in a process, and his report was very much focused on outcomes. And in fact, he made some overarching recommendations about the way in which laws are written, and he really criticised laws and said that they're too confusing and that's the reason no one complies with them. And he said that they actually should be much more understanding what the purpose and the outcome is achieved, and then writing a law. And he said that basically all the laws in the financial sector should be reviewed with that in mind. Not sure when that's going to happen. It'll be a big job, I think. But so I do think that that bringing that legal frame to it and being concerned about an outcome was something that we can say from the Financial Sector Royal Commission.
Okay. And Christie, the Royal Commission into family violence happened in 2016, so it's been underway for 3 years now in terms of implementation. How do you feel, but there were a huge number of recommendations. It was something like 227,
They're
if I'm
embedded
remembering.
in here somewhere.
So do you think that the recommendations were specific enough, or do you think that there were too many of them?
Look, I feel like, when I first walked in to see it, yes, I do think there was far too many. But as I sort of moved through it and sort of, thank goodness they provided a summary, by the way, which is a lot shorter than like a pile this big that I had to move through. You did see there was a reason for them. And I feel like, yes, it probably was this a bit of overkill with it, but I think there was a lot of energy, there was a lot of positivity, there was a lot of let's get this right, we need to do something. Especially for, the way it was termed as the number one, law and order issue of our country. So I do feel that when, I moved through them, there was reason for it. But, I would say to your question, for me, you're right, there was some very general recommendations. And the one for me that really stood out was around prevention. It sort of touched on prevention, but it wasn't specific. And I feel like prevention was such a huge key to the Royal Commission, and there wasn't really that much sort of stated. It was very light on. I didn't feel there was much weight to it, but I guess what it did is provide opportunity through all the task forces that were created. And I feel like this is a step, when you've been through it, you know it and you understand it, but when you haven't, there are these task forces, which I do hope that, this is taken on board for this Royal Commission, where those sort of intimate discussions can happen about it being light on. And that's what we did. We raised it and we were very honest about we felt it was light on and what needed to happen. So that sort of then established more guidelines and policies but the recommendation was our key to have that there to then establish the need for it to be, I guess, more specific about how. And also then there was a lot of task forces that separated it off, so VSAC being like the primary holder. So until any recommendation could be effectively ticked off by our external implementation monitor, that needed to go through the Victim Survivor Advisory Council to be literally ticked off. So if we weren't happy with what we saw, we simply would say it hasn't met the need of the recommendation. So we were really fortunate. We had an ex-police commissioner as our monitor, and he was super passionate about getting it right. So he, in fact, would just basically turn up with a report saying, we haven't completed it because it's not right. And it's probably going to be another few months. So he was very supportive in that. So I feel like as you go along, you will see things. But yeah, it was a bit disappointing that a few were generalised, but for ours it was definitely prevention. But there was ways to work through that and get it more specific as we move through the years. Yeah.
Excellent.
Meg, final view from you, from what might be, just looking at the time, our final question. What, in the Royal Commission into Child Sex Abuse, what did you learn about recommendations? You talked before about the difficulty getting disability on the agenda and understood.
Yeah, we were quite happy with many of the recommendations from the Child Abuse Royal Commission. I mean, that being said, I think inevitably there were some gaps, but I feel like we gave it a pretty good go along the way to really pick up in the drafts and in the consultation papers along the way to pick up where there were those gaps. And so the outcome at the end was quite good. I mean, I know I sound like a broken record, but I think I will restate again that would not have been possible without the systemic advocacy that we were able to do along the way of that Royal Commission at every stage of the policy process. I think that the capacity, what I would be more concerned about, and what I am more concerned about, I think, is the capacity to follow up on those recommendations. There are some really quality recommendations that we're really struggling to find the resources to kind of keep on the government about at the moment. We've just finished doing a kind of a review of the process of the Royal Commission and of the last Royal Commission that we were involved with and the recommendations. And there are lots of things that we really need to keep on the government about, but it's just really hard to find the capacity at the moment because we're simply not resourced to do it. And so, and again, I think just going back to what I mentioned about the Royal Commission into deaths in custody, I think there were fantastic recommendations in that Royal Commission as well, and in many inquests since then, but without the political will and without the capacity to follow up from advocacy organisations, you just don't get those outcomes. So the recommendations are very important, and I think we're all here ready and prepared to do the work of getting good recommendations out of this Royal Commission. I really cross my fingers that we're able to do that. Cross my fingers and kind of put my my shoulder to the grindstone or whatever. But I think that it will be about how are we funded to follow up? How are we, as advocacy and representative bodies, really resourced to hold the government to account in the recommendations that they come up with out of this process? That's my main concern.
Excellent. And I think we've got one final question. Many questions on this will be asked, of course, over the course of the Royal Commission, but certainly the engagement in the audience just is a demonstration of how important it is. But over to you.
Hi, my name is Yusuf. I'm a student from Melbourne Polytechnic, and I want to be a future advocate for disabled people. So I don't have 30 years or 40 years of experience, but I do have lived experience. I've got a very mild case of cerebral palsy. I have noticed that my whole life has been through scratch and crawl through your way through mud to get what you want. I just want to know, my question is, I guess, to the Commission is basically, are you guys going to look at things where you can foster independency rather than dependency? Because our system that we have, I find, as a student, as someone who's in their infant, is always creating dependency, not independency. And I just hope that you guys can take a bit of recommendation on my behalf that we as a community need to strive that people with disabilities can connect with independency and live the life that they want to live, not dependency. And that's a very common thing that I find in this industry, that we're still stuck in this dependency of trying to live our life the way we want. So can you guys tell me, are you guys going to foster that sort of like decision making and incorporating that in your commission?
Yeah, thank you, Yusuf. That's a really important comment. And I might just throw to Meg to talk about this, because the terms of reference for the Royal Commission are quite broad.
I mean, you're right, the Royal Commission terms of reference are hugely broad. I mean, I think something that our organisation, so People with Disability Australia, National Cross Disability Organisation, I think something that we would really like to see addressed as a driver of violence, a systemic driver of violence in Australia against people with disability, is the lack of legal equality that people with disability have in Australia. So we have a situation in Australia where our laws, our legal systems, don't allow people with disability to be equal before the law. And that means that often people are in situations of guardianship, of financial management, of things that, and also abuse, violence and neglect. People aren't supported to be making decisions that mean that they have power and control over their lives. And that is, I guess, really the outcome of that legal inequality. So we really hope, I think, and will be advocating for this Royal Commission to be looking at not just at examples and cases of violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation against people with disability, but about, what it means that people with disability are not supported to make their own decisions in many situations in Australia. We need to, I'm working on a paper on the authorisation of restrictive practices in New South Wales. Now, restrictive practices, we know, are often very abusive towards people with disability, and the focus needs to be on eliminating them, on getting rid of them. But we have a situation in New South Wales where the government is authorising them, and not only authorising them, but allowing service providers to be at the head of panels that are authorising them. Now, that does not create a situation where people with disability are actually kind of the drivers of how their supports are going to be provided. So what we're arguing for all the time is people with disability need to have supported decision-making. There can't be substitute decision-making where someone else is deciding for them. And if there's really, really, really no other option than this so-called substitute decision-making, then it needs to be decision-making that's driven by human rights, not by a sort of best interest. What's in your best interests as a person with disability? No, it's about protecting human rights. So that's my inadequate, but I think you're absolutely right, and I think there's a huge, huge, huge shift that we need in Australian culture and law to make sure that people with disability are supported to make decisions that drive and guide their own lives, and that's what we need to see as an audit of all laws that take away the decision-making capacity of people with disability would be a really great outcome and thing that this Royal Commission could do. So thank you for your question.
Great question.
Excellent note to end on, I think.
Delegates, can you join me in thanking the panel, thanking everyone for their contributions? I'm sure you'll agree, an important discussion for us all to have. We'll now break for afternoon tea, and we shall reconvene at precisely 3:20. So I shall see you all then.